Have you ever thought, or even said to a family member, they are out of their mind. I can't believe he did that. Did you hear what she said? It happens to all of us, I'm sure, one time or another. When our kids were teenagers, I was quite sure that they were rolling their eyeballs so far upward in response to yet another inane comment from the old man that those eyeballs would just roll all the way back down backwards. This response, it's experienced by the best of us. At the beginning of our gospel reading, Jesus has returned home, presumably to Nazareth. It sounded chaotic, lots of stress, so busy he couldn't eat, so many large crowds following him around. His father, his family, and yes, some historians believe that in addition to Mary and Joseph, there were 4 brothers: James, Joseph Jr., known as Jose, Simon and Jude, and likely 2 sisters, Salome, and another one called either Mary or Anna. The record keeping, not that great at that time. They, his family, heard that Jesus was home and immediately went out to restrain him because people were saying he's gone out of his mind. The phrase, people are saying, suggests there's no real evidence. Not that they heard it themselves. They're just responding to conjecture, to gossip, which, when something is told often enough, starts to sound true. Conspiracy theories are formed as a result of that. Did the family seem to accept the same allegations about Jesus' ministry and preaching as the authorities who were against him? Or perhaps they were there out of love. He was in a struggle against the authorities, and perhaps they were trying to protect him. What might you do if you had a family member that took a megaphone and headed just over there to Dundas Square every day? Mark describes that Jesus continues preaching a parable about the apocalyptic power of Satan. And then some of his family shows up. His mother and his brothers. They were standing way outside the circle, way back from the huge crowd around Jesus. The tension between Jesus and his family is building. First, they want to restrain his ministry, his healing, his preaching, because of what others are saying. And then they're left to get his attention way outside the circle, not inside the circle or beside him. And Jesus, well, he responds coolly, not inviting them in, not asking them to come on down, but asking the question, who are my mother and my brothers? And then he looks around at the crowd and says, here are my mother and my brothers. Whoever does the will of God is my brother and my sister and my mother. The inner circle are believers. They're strangers connected by their love of God. This connected belief creates them into God's family. Does it include his immediate family? We don't know. If they continue to hold the belief that Jesus is out of his mind, then maybe not. The social construct underlying this story was a common belief that elders are to be respected and looked after in first century Middle East. This social construct, well, it increases the tension underlying this situation. Not only does the passage suggest that believers might forsake their family of origin, the closest ties any of us start in this world, it points to a newly constituted Christian family. When you think about it, it's an extraordinary scene. It's an example of a tough, messy family situation. And many of you, well, you know exactly what that's about. I've mentioned that I help run a charity for ex-prisoners transitioning back into the community. Their stories, well, they're universally hard. They need housing because their family, their friends, almost everyone have rejected them for their crimes, for the embarrassment of a family member in prison, for how they've acted, or perhaps for the drug addiction and mental health issues that have followed many of them. I saw it too in my hospital work. Patients in the mental health or forensics units alone in this world, never receiving a visitor, making up friends to talk about with me, to fight off that piercing sense of loneliness. Hardship among family happens among you too. I know, I've heard it. Rejection because of your sexual orientation, your choice of religion, for seeking to be educated, or for no reason that you can understand or has been explained. There is good news in this passage. It recognizes that when families hurt us, it's not okay. Further, it gives permission to say to ourselves, I do not need to make this right. If I'm rejected by my family, I remain part of God's family. This is the good news of Mark, that we're part of God's family no matter what the state of our family of origin. Jesus refused the summons from his family. Did he feel betrayed by them? Hard to tell. However, what is clear is that Jesus did not choose isolation. He chose a much larger family, God's family. Jesus offers us an alternative. He made clear that a family of origin need not hold authority over what we believe or how we exercise our freedom of religion. Part of the message may well be that rejection and betrayal is not forever. Perhaps there can be reconciliation with our family. Perhaps the will of God is to encourage us to be intentional about our relationships. In some cases, to be open to reconciliation. A couple of examples come to mind. One of our ex-prisoners at RJHO, I'll call him Doug, he'd been estranged from his family for 30 years. Now in his 70s, he settled into one of our houses. He became the helpful guy in the house. He knew how to fix things. He'd listen to the other guys, the younger guys. He'd make coffee. He'd be a stabilizing influence. And then he got ill, really ill. He had listed a sister as next of kin, and so we reached out to her. When she heard how he had turned his life around, she reached out to her two nephews, Doug's sons, who now lived in British Columbia. When they heard about the turnaround in their father's life, and now his desire for family, they responded. Gently at first, with FaceTime calls, and then they introduced his grandsons to him. And finally, they paid for an airfare for Doug to fly out west and reconnect with his family. A family now connected, still together, with the help of men who moved into this transition house with Doug, who became Doug's family, a place of stability for him. What is family? The combination of people, does it really matter? Mom, dad, and kids, two dads and a child, two women without children, a cousin or a nephew, or another combination. I believe it's someone who is in relationship, who offers mutual respect, love, without judgment, with support, commitment, and kindness. What other descriptors would you add? In the palliative care unit I worked in, there was a man named John who had a tough life. He was out on the streets, petty crimes, short stints in jail. He lost a wife and a daughter along the way, lost touch with them. In his dying days, relatively young with cancer, he asked if we could track down his daughter, thinking she might like to see him. I found her with a little effort and called her and explained that John had but days left, and they'd asked me to invite her to come for one last visit. She responded angrily and basically told me to get lost. I sat with that for a bit. I had in the past had to explain to dying patients who were estranged from families that the family member was refusing to connect. That's a really hard conversation in a palliative care unit. I sat on this for an hour and was about to go see John when my phone rang. The daughter, she had changed her mind. She would travel to Toronto for the 3-hour trip the following day. She arrived with her husband. I stayed long enough to figure out this was going to be a peaceful start to this conversation. I went by a few minutes later and the husband was in the hall, the daughter by her dad's bed. 10 minutes or so later, the daughter and her husband were leaving. I asked how it went and she said good, tears in her eyes. I got distracted by another patient and went by to check in on John about a half an hour later. The nurse was in the room. John was not. Well, his body was, but he had died 10 minutes earlier, the nurse said tenderly. The mysterious, powerful impact of loved ones, one of God's mysteries. Some family situations, well, they're just warm and tender from the start. Pat and I had the opportunity to attend a Passover Seder of close friends of ours this year. Recognizing the context of the war in Gaza, our friend Donald rewrote the script to speak of the pain of anti-Semitism, the pain and the death of innocent Palestinians in Gaza. So many questions looking for God for answers. I looked around this table of 4 generations, handing down the traditions of the Passover, one to the other. It was a wonderful sight. A family grappling with these really hard issues, all coming together. What conclusions to draw? This is a tough topic. Whether your stories of family are hard, filled with rejection and hurt, or wonderful and supportive, or somewhere in between that offers a mix of both, families can be messy, awesome, hopeless, and really fantastic, all in the same day. What have your experiences been with family? What have you learned? When have you turned to God for help or for understanding? And what does Mark mean by ending the passage? Whoever does the will of God is my brother and my sister and my mother. To love your neighbor as yourself, to follow Jesus' preaching and teaching? Hard to tell. Is the will of God to try our best with our families of origin, but also giving us permission not to accept hurt? But one conclusion is clear. It is the will of God to offer all of us the love of God's family, in addition to, or perhaps in alternative to, other relationships that we call family. Now, this sermon would not be complete without mention of other important family members. Our pets. I'm thinking that while this story was left out of the Bible, I've been unable to find it. I've checked all the versions of my Bible, but I haven't been able to find this one, but I'm sure it's there. Jesus' family likely had a golden retriever named Jeremiah, who everybody called Jerry. Now, I'd like to think that Jerry came along with the brothers to the crowd scene, and in his big brown eyes was unquestioning love for Jesus and for those all around. Dogs, they love unconditionally. Our dog Skipper was at my feet as I typed this. There's an earthly representation of the feeling of God's unconditional love upon all of us. And back at the house with Jesus' sister was their cat Sophia, wise and beautiful, staying above the fray as cats do, but in her own independent way, offering support, a back to scratch, and a few purrs of love. Where is your family? Is it a cat, a best friend dog, a neighbor, a partner, your children, a cousin, a nephew? Hopefully, you do not find yourself in isolation. And if you do, reach out to us. We are your family. God's family is your family. We admit with all of our diversity, our unconditional acceptance of people. We offer this as best we can, supported by God's loving, mysterious presence. The good news is that we are all brothers and sisters, some with pets in God's wonderful world. With God's love, let's make it so. Jason and I are now going to move into the blessing of the pets, and we're hoping the rain is continuing to hold off just a little here. I first want to read a poem by Mary Oliver called Little Dog's Rhapsody in the Night. As I read it, think of it as applicable to a memory of a pet, perhaps recently deceased, or perhaps long ago, or a pet that's squirming in your arms today or is at home. There's two squirming here on the, which is great. This is what Mary Oliver said. He puts his cheek against mine and makes small expressive sounds. And when I'm awake or awake enough, he turns upside down, his forepaws in the air and his eyes dark and fervent. Tell me you love me, he says. Tell me again. Could there be a sweeter arrangement? Over and over, he gets to ask. I get to tell. We now want to turn to those pets who have died, those who have crossed the rainbow bridge, as it's frequently referred to when a cherished pet passes on. Unfortunately, we do not necessarily give people the full opportunity to grieve the loss of a wonderful pet who they've had a deep attachment to. A recent Globe First Person piece said this: when an animal joins a family, they are knit into its fabric. When they pass, they leave holes that need time to repair.